Hello and welcome back to CT10. It's been a little while since our last episode, and I've been a little bit lazy. I went on my belated honeymoon and took a little bit of time just to enjoy life, but I'm back, and this is our unofficial launch of our season 2. This season will be focusing on mini pods, where I break down one learning objective and one SAQ associated with that objective. My goal is to have 10 episodes out before the second primary sitting of this year. So if you have a specific LO you want me to cover, please email me at anirudh@sweetdreamsanesthesia.com and I will try to go through that topic in one of these episodes. Now today we have a very special episode where I'm joined by 3 candidates that have just passed the primary exam of the first sitting this year. Nathan, San-Rene and Elliot have been absolutely amazing, and I know you're going to love this discussion. We cover every topic you can think of, from how to make a study plan, what it's like to sit the written exam, how to get your best performance for the viva, the real emotional struggles that you go through trying to pass this exam, and how you make sure you keep some semblance of a real life while you're trying to study. All 3 of them were so genuine and so willing to share. I cannot wait for you to listen to this podcast. You're going to absolutely love it. I want to thank all 3 again and congratulate them on getting through this momentous exam. And with that said, let's dive straight in.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Thank you guys for joining me. A huge congratulations to all 3 of you for getting through the part 1. How do you guys feel and how are you guys enjoying this moment? Don't all start at once.
It's good. It's definitely such a relief. I feel like you put your heart and soul into it and you put everything on pause, and it's so hard on your family members and everything, but it's like once it's done, it's just the biggest relief, if anything. It's like such a physical and metaphorical sigh of thank goodness that it's finished.
Yeah, I agree. It's all relief, really.
I think people that hopefully are listening to this, they'll be probably in envy because you guys are past the part 1 and they're at the start of their journey and they're trying to get to there. And I remember when I was starting, it was like, how do I get to that end goal? It just seems so far away. And so I guess I have all 3 of you on for a specific reason, to help kind of guide someone that's just starting or in the middle of their journey kind of through this process. And Elliot, I'll ask you first, if you could like somehow take me back to when you were like deciding to start studying and you looked at this crappy curriculum that was overly like huge and you were contemplating how you're going to study and how you're going to actually make a study plan. What was your initial feelings and how did you go about that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would say is that it's always seems overwhelming at the start, but it's doable. We've all done it. It's really, really achievable. You just have to have a study plan that I think you formulate early and try to stick with it as best as possible. What I did at the start, before I started a study plan or anything like that, was just getting a feel of people who have just gone through the exam, or having a look at the registrars that are just about to sit. And I think that was good to, I guess, get an idea of type of commitments from like a lifestyle point of view that you do kind of have to make, especially in the last few months leading up to the exam, as well as getting an idea of how to kind of tackle the whole thing. So in terms of the study plan itself, I used Mac 95. I recommend everyone uses Mac 95. I think it's such an invaluable resource. It can actually generate a study plan for you. And there are a few different resources out there, like Stanley Tay's Adrenaline Memories, and I think one of his podcasts also has kind of like a template study plan as to how to attack it. The only thing I'd say with my study plan is, try to get one in early, try to stick to it as much as possible, because inevitably you will eventually start to fall behind a little bit. So give yourself a little bit of extra time. And then with the study plan, I think in retrospect, try to cover everything with at least 3 months left. I think if you do that and then give yourself, so what we did was we covered everything with 3 months to go. And then we revisited everything and consolidated our information over 2 months. And then the last 1 month was essentially kind of game day preparation, which was just, high fidelity SAQs and MCQs. That's how I'd start, definitely.
That's really good advice. And the one thing I think is when we start making a study plan, I see most people being like, oh, I might sit BT1 first sitting or BT2 first sitting. And there's a lot of indecision. Did you just decide, no, this is my date that I'm going to sit? Or were you like, no, I'm going to be flexible and see how I'm going?
No, having spoken to people who had, just sat and who were going through the process, everyone says that if you start at the start of BT1, if you start as an IT and, you don't have any previous anesthetic experience, you give yourself a few months to bed in to actually learn some anesthetics, and then you go for BT2, the first sitting of BT2, and that gives you a full kind of year. And I think after I spoke to some people, I said to myself, yeah, I'm going to go for that sitting, because if I run into any issues, then I'll have the second sitting of BT2 to give it another go before I, if you sat for the first time in the second sitting of your BT2 and you had any issues, then you're looking at kind of going into BTE, which is not the end of the world, but, if that's avoidable, because you could sit at an earlier sitting, I would say go for it.
Yeah. And I guess this question goes out to all three of you. The one thing that I find is that everyone studies at a different pace, and it seemed like you had a plan in place, Elliot, too. If you were going to be, behind, you knew that, I might need a few extra weeks. How did you guys each find out, am I someone that needs 6 months to get ready for this exam? Am I someone that needs 9 months? Is there any tips that you have to figure out actually how much time you need?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think Elliot's given some great advice. All of us, we were, well, me and Elliot and a couple of other guys were in the same study group. We followed the study plan that Elliot came up with anyway, and so it was quite nicely spaced out. I think it's just taking into consideration what your study style is. Like, everyone's done some study before in med school, and whether you take a bit longer, or you can't retain things for as long. I think taking that into account, and then your life circumstances as well. Obviously, if you have kids, or that life's just a bit rocky, or at some stage, I think just taking those kind of life events into account as well into the study plan. I think early on is just all about plan, and then trying to stick to the plan as much as possible. I think you won't be able to follow the plan 100%, but having that kind of guide sort of sets you on a good path, I think.
And you have a mental and a physical checklist that you're actually achieving something, and it's giving you some, tick marks along the way. And you mentioned something that I wanted to ask you specifically, being a father and studying for this exam. I was lucky enough to study with no dependents. I don't know, you can call that lucky or unlucky. And I found it hard enough doing that. How do you actually balance studying, which everyone on the outside just seems like, what the hell are you doing? You're spending 24 hours just cramming and having the worst time of your life, and actually making sure that your family still love you and you're giving time to your kids.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one. I think the important thing is it's just all about communication. And it's just like any people go in with spouses, without kids, or family even. I think early on, I kind of sat down with my wife, and she's quite understanding. Just said, this is what we need, what I need. And then she, we talked about what she needed and what the family capacity is, rather than just my own capacity to do X, Y, Z. And so she, certain things were just non-negotiable. Like when I got home from work, we'd do bedtime, bath time, all of that until the kid was asleep. And then whatever time after that I could have, or like in the mornings. But there were certain things that are just like, I had to be there to do that. And so we sort of established that early on, what the priorities were in the family, and then I could kind of work around that. And then like days off, she would, as much as possible, help me by, taking kid to Brizzy, or just giving me some space to study. And then there'd be like a set amount of time. And then after that, when they got back, that was it. Like my time was done. So just setting boundaries like that. the other thing I found really helpful was talking to other colleagues. There's lots of people. I'm not the first one to have done it. I won't be the last person to have done it. Like lots of people have done exams with kids, or lots and lots of kids.
Yeah.
And other family commitments, and talking to them sort of was an encouragement because, well, they've done it before and they can give specific advice about how they got through it, and some was helpful. And so I think talking to lots of people, there's a few podcast episodes as well on other sort of anesthesia podcasts when they've talked to parents as well. I listened to that, and there's just, if anything, just reassured me that it was doable. And so it just helped me to just like get on with it.
You might not want to share this, but did you have times where you felt like your relationship was fractured? I know that when I was studying, at that time, it was my girlfriend who then became my wife. There was definitely times where I felt like my relationship was getting fractured because concentrating on studying all the time, you kind of just lose focus on how to be a good partner. And it seemed like you had good boundaries with, making sure you were spending time with your kids. Did you try to keep date nights alive or anything like that?
Oh yeah. Look, I think that for sure was a really big challenge. I think, like fortunately for me, like I guess me and my little like daughter, like we've got a pretty good relationship. Like with me and my wife, because I think a lot of the time that we sacrificed was like time between like me and her. So I think at times it got quite tough. We still like tried to get out when we could, like if we could get babysitting and things like that. But even then, I think it was still pretty challenging. And I think having like a clear study plan with an end date is important for that kind of thing too, at least because it gives them something to look forward to. I know it's extra pressure, but in a way it gives them something to focus on as well, rather than like something nebulous that, we are like a team working towards that point. And then hopefully after that, then there might be some sort of like reprieve. I guess that's what we found helpful, like when we were working through it together.
And you bring up something really important, which is this added pressure we put on ourselves when we give ourselves this end goal. And then what happens when we don't reach that end goal, and what is life like there? And I know it's absolutely tough mentally to come back from it in San-Rene. I wanted to ask you about that because this was your second time sitting. And I find that anyone who is sitting for the second time, it's like just amazing just to see how much mental fortitude and courage you have to sit for the second time. Because I know that if I had failed the first time, and there's a high chance that anyone can fail the first time, I honestly don't know how I would have picked myself up, because I gave like my whole life to this exam. And when you feel like you've given everything and it's still not enough for that end goal, how do you bring yourself back up? And what did you kind of learn from that initial attempt to make yourself successful the second time?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for bringing up this topic, because I feel like there's lots of resources on how to pass it the first time and ace it. And, you speak to lots of bosses who are like, your first shot's your best shot for anything. And so it was hard. Sorry.
No. We all understand.
I think it was lots of factors. And the hardest bit was that it was hard on my husband. And what I wanted as like our initial future, like, you, as you say, you set this end date and you're like, oh great, I'm going to have my life back after this. And lots of things, there are so many different factors to like sitting this exam, right? Like you need to be optimally prepared. You need to feel like you're in the best mind frame for it, that you've like done your best, you put everything on hold, and that you're like giving it your best shot. And so like no one ever plans to sit twice, but so yeah, it was hard, but I knew going in the first time, I was honest to myself, there were holes in what I knew. And I walked into that first time being like, hot damn, I hope they don't ask me anything about like this one topic, because it's like, if they do, I have like bare minimum knowledge and I'll be able to scrape a 1 at best for that. And there were just a couple of different topics that came up with those SAQs where I was like, that's not looking good. And so I walked out being like, it's 50-50 whether or not I have a pass from that written. And I knew that going in. And I also knew that because I wasn't happy with the degree to which I had prepared the first time. And I knew that deep down, even though I had like, you know, everyone spends a lot of time studying, a lot of sacrifice. But that was something which I knew going in. And also, like, I'm a very methodical studier, so I knew that there were holes, and that made me really anxious going in as well. And I'm not a very anxious person, but this exam does like crazy things to you. And so that night before I sat was like so bizarre. I had no sleep the night before, and I'm the sort of person who like falls asleep anywhere and anytime during the day. Like on a plane, I'm asleep before the plane takes off and I'll wake up by the time the plane lands. Except like the night before, I could not sleep a wink at all. And I just felt really, really anxious for the first time in my life. And I was like, this must be what it's like when people have like anxiety. And so knowing that going in, I was like, something's not quite right, but I'll just give it my best, whatever. And so I still did that going into the written. And so then the second time round, I worked on a lot of the things that I thought were the root cause of that. So being happy with the degree to which I knew my own knowledge. And that's, I think a lot of that comes down to self-confidence and how much you back yourself. And there was a really good sports psychologist who I listened to a talk that he gave, and he's like, there's a difference between self-confidence and basically like your confidence in your clinical skill and how much you baseline back yourself in how much you know. So if you know that you are at a baseline, your knowledge is good, your confidence can waver on top of that, and it's okay because you're at a minimum to be able to succeed, basically. And so I knew that I just needed to get my baseline of knowledge higher so that I was happier with myself to be able to get in and be able to write an answer to anything. So that was something that I worked on a lot between the first and the second sitting. I plugged those holes that I had. I worked on a lot of the things that like I think were the source of anxiety for the first time when I sat. And I changed a lot of life things that I did as well. So like the night before, we didn't stay at my parents' house. We stayed at a hotel the second time. And there was just a lot of psychological change between the first and the second time. And it was quite interesting because talking to my husband afterwards, he was like, I could see that there was a big difference between the way you approached it the first time, where it was like, oh my goodness, I hope these things don't come up, compared to the second time, which was like, they could ask me anything and I can confidently write something about anything and it'll be okay. And that just took time to get to that stage. And it took a lot of bosses sitting me down and being like, you know enough, like you don't need to be worried. You knew enough the first time, but you just felt like you didn't. So you need to work on your self-confidence. And so I'm very grateful for a lot of our bosses at SCOO who sat me down and were like, you know, you can do this. Like you don't need to be anxious about your baseline of what you know. That was basically the thing that probably I changed the most between the first and the second sitting.
No, thank you. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing what you went through. You didn't, you know, this is such a sensitive topic, and I've spoken with so many people before, and it's obviously on this open platform. You didn't have to share any of that, and I really appreciate it. And the other thing is that I think the reason I say when I see people sitting for the second time and I go, I couldn't have done that myself, is because I don't know whether I had been strong enough to go through that emotional growth to get myself strong enough if I had failed the first time. Because every time we do an exam in med school, we usually pass the first time. We're obviously the type of people that will pass every exam first time, and we've never kind of really been ever faced with real rejection in our life. And emotionally growing actually like scared me. I'm like, if I fail this exam, I don't know what else I can give, and I don't know how I'm going to bounce back from it. So just hearing how you bounce back from it and, you know, the tips, it's kind of amazing. And I think you actually emotionally like grew way more than I did actually just studying for the exam the first time. because I still live in this world going, oh yeah, I passed the first time. Cool. And it's like, I'm still waiting for that magic bullet to like bring me down to earth and be like, you're not who you think you are, you know, you're not, if that kind of makes sense. Or maybe I'm just
Yeah, for sure.
rambling.
No, I think it's really true. Like this was, you know, honest to God, this was the first thing that I had really failed in my life. And so, like, I remember calling my mum and being like, Mum, I failed this exam. And I was like, oh no, my Asian mum is going to be so disappointed in me. And she was just like, oh, don't worry, it's okay. Like, you know, you just sit it again. She has no idea about this exam, right? She just knows that I'm like sitting this big exam for my career. And she was like, you know, you can just sit it like 5, 6, 7, 8 times. Don't worry, your dad and I are still proud of you. Like, you just do it again anytime. And I was just like, it's very kind of you. And it was actually like quite like a heartwarming moment to be like, you know, life goes on. It's fine. You just pick yourself back up. And at the time, you're like, this is a disaster. Like, this is such a significant setback in my life. And you think, like, how am I ever going to do this again? But you just do. You just pick up your socks and you know, life goes on the next day and the sun will rise and it's going to be okay. It feels, to be honest, I probably can't say this on your podcast, but it feels really shitty. Like it's like, I can't believe this has happened.
There's no rating on podcasts. You can say whatever you like.
Yeah, it felt really shit, but you just do it. You just like, we just crack on, you know?
And it's funny, once you're through, and I feel like everyone can now relate, once you're through, no one gives a shit anymore. Everyone's like, oh, did you pass that exam? Yeah, cool. All right, move on. Conversation's ended. That's it. Congratulations. On a lighter note, can I ask, what did you guys actually enjoy studying the most? Elliot?
Ooh. I did enjoy cardiac and respiratory physiology, and I enjoyed a lot of the pharmacology. I think as someone that I did a lot of rote learning in med school. I never really learned concepts, and I felt like I was always at a little bit of a disadvantage in crit care before I started studying for this exam, because I just didn't know how anything worked. Like, you know how to manage a patient, but you just don't know anything. And I think going back and actually going through from like a cellular level and actually learning all the concepts is really nice, because you can actually apply that to your clinical practice. Like, I know people say that, oh, like it's like a very book heavy exam. There's a lot of stuff that you don't really apply, but there are a lot of concepts that you do take forward and, you know, are able to apply into your clinical practice. And I think for me, like the core cardiac and respiratory physiology stuff was the stuff that stood out the most to me in terms of being advantageous to what I can apply to my daily practice now.
It's funny. And for the listeners that were listening, as soon as Elliot said, oh, I studied rote learning at med school, I think all three of us just nodded our head going, yep, yeah. That's how we all got through med school. What about the opposite side? Was there anything that you wish you had skipped studying that, you know, at the end of the day wasn't actually that useful? Is there anything that you're like, oh, I time wasted so much on this one little thing that I really should have just not done this? Nathan or San-Rene?
Lasers.
The hard thing is that you just never know, right? Like,
Yeah.
you get a whole SAQ on lasers, and it's like, great, lucky I spent that half a day learning about the intricacies of YAG and and lasing mediums. So it's so easy in retrospect to be like, oh, what a waste of time. But you just never know what's going to come up. Like, and it's a fair shot at anything, really. Like, if you get that one SAQ and you've studied it, lucky you. But it's like, if you hadn't, you'd be spewing. So I think it so depends on what sitting you do.
And that goes back to your point about maybe us being our worst enemies, you know, us getting in our own heads with that anxiety. Because I remember getting to the written day, walking to the written exam, and it was like, oh my God, what are they going to ask me? Are they going to ask me this? And then as soon as you guys can correct me if you're wrong, but as soon as you flip the paper and you do your perusal and you go through 15 questions, you go repeat, new, I know, new, I know, new, I know, repeat. And you're like, oh yeah, I got this. Like, it's just about me, like being able to smash out all the stuff I need in 10 minutes. But then nothing goes to plan, and I remember being like, oh, I got this exam, and I did my first question. Had been practicing 8 minutes per SAQ, totally fine, and then my first answer, 12 minutes on the clock, and I'm already
Yeah,
behind. And
so true.
and the next thing I wanted to kind of ask you guys was, we practice so much in the simulation setting of replicating an exam, but nothing goes to plan on the day. What was it? What was the big difference between actually sitting the exam and then the practice exam?
I think for me, I had a similar experience in the written. Like, I started off the first question jittery, and by the time like the middle of the paper, I was 3 minutes behind. And then trying to like catch up for the rest of the paper was pretty tough. It was like it felt like a frenzy. It was just to put down whatever came into my head onto the paper and then just move on. I think in simulations, the advice that's given to practice your SAQs at 8 to 9 minutes is helpful, because in the real thing, it will take 10 minutes, like just because of exam jitters or or you remember more because it's exam and everything's just coming into your head and you want to put down more. And so just making sure you simulate that, and then making sure that there's some, I guess, fidelity to it, in the sense that you give your questions to somebody to be marked, so that you're not just like doing the paper and then putting it in the corner or marking it yourself. To be able to simulate doing the exam, and then it will count for something because somebody will mark it for you, and then you'll get proper feedback on it. I think that was really helpful, sort of simulating it and then doing a lot of it. Like, we did a lot of to-time exam papers, really. And I think in the end that did really count. It's like you don't run a marathon without having at least run like half of it at some point. And so it would be advisable probably to at least do like a half-length paper before you come to the full-length paper.
Yeah, no, that's very sound advice. And this all makes sense. And if you're listening to it, you probably think this is all basic stuff. But was there one thing that the day didn't meet your expectations, like that you had thought was going to be, oh, this is how it's going to run, and that actually wasn't what met your expectations, that I think anyone that hasn't sat maybe might not be ready for?
So the main thing that was different for me on the day that I didn't expect was that I was seated by my candidate number at like the very back of the room, and I had like 3 heads in front of me, and I realized I like couldn't really see the timer that well. So I don't know how you prepare for that, but that was stressful. I would recommend when you're practicing doing your SAQs. So firstly, as Nathan said, once you get really into the last few weeks, you should be trying to do them to 8 or 9 minutes. Because if you can get an answer out in 8 or 9 minutes, the content, and you've got to be really harsh with yourself on the day, and just know that when you get to that certain time point, you have to move on. Otherwise, you can just fall behind, as we were talking about before. But when you're practicing, I would use like a computer and get like one of those clocks like off Google and use that as your timer. Like, when we started, we used our phones, we used watches, but none of that stuff is going to be with you on the day. So trying to keep yourself timed to a clock is the best way to prepare, I think.
No, very good advice. What about you, San-Rene? Did any of your expectations, I guess, didn't get met on the day of your exam?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was one of the things that I was really shocked by the first time I sat, was that my reaction, my initial gut reaction to when I saw a new question that I hadn't seen before, I just like froze, and I'd be like, I've got a minute in my perusal to like think of a structure, but nothing's coming to me. So then I'd be like, oh, my minute's done, move on. And then when it came to like my 10 minutes to like write the answer, I would just like go back into this frozen mode, which I hadn't experienced and I hadn't anticipated for the first time I sat. And so that was that was something which I worked on a lot between the first and the second sitting as well, was how to manage that gut reaction, but also just practicing new unexpected questions which I hadn't seen before. And that was just a lot of practice that I did. I would ask fellows at work, I would ask bosses who liked the primary to like make up questions for me. So I hadn't seen them before in Mac 95, and just work on like my internal monologue of like, that's fine, I can do this, stay calm. You can write a structure out, you can bang something out in 8 minutes and it'll make sense. And you can at least get, at the very least, a 2 for it. So that was definitely something that I worked on a lot. And that was an unexpected reaction from the first time I sat.
Very good advice from all three of you. My unexpected reaction was, you know how you do like your 8-minute questions and you do your 3-minute questions to try to like just smash out as many as possible? And they always tell you, just write your structure in your 3 minutes, just write your structure in your 3 minutes. By the time I got to the exam, I kind of knew what my structure was for any question that kind of came up. And so on the day, unexpectedly, when I had my perusal, I didn't write my structure for any question in my perusal time because I knew what my structure was going to be. I just wrote, what is the one thing that I can't miss in this answer? And so I literally wrote like 2 words for each question, and that was it. It's like, I can't not mention this. And I wrote exactly what it was in like 1 or 2 words, moved to the next one. And I'd done my perusal in like 7 minutes. And then I just like took time and I just went back to my first question. I'm like, okay, I know what my structure is for each one because I've done it so many times, and I know what I can't miss. Now let me just have this extra 7 minutes to just be like, what am I exactly going to write for my first question? And that was it. And it was really unexpected because I didn't think I would do that. And I guess it was because I had done so much preparation and, like you guys said, had replicated the scenario as much as possible. But yeah, I didn't expect myself to behave like that or come up with a new theory, thinking that being a pretty rigid person, I wasn't going to come up with something like that. Moving on to the final thing I want to talk about, which is Viva Day. Oh, stress is a whole new level. I don't think you can describe stress on a Viva Day. Did you guys feel like you were getting Viva fatigue, getting closer to the Viva? And how did you try to keep your peak performance kind of going so that you were the best on the day?
Yes, I mean, I was definitely getting Viva fatigue by the end. I think I went to a few Viva nights, and then we'd in our study group Viva each other outside of work, and then at work you go to find bosses to get Vivas. And so I think by the time we got to the last week, I basically said no more Vivas for the last week, just because I think there's some merit in obviously doing lots and lots of Vivas, but there's also some merit, I think, taking time to reflect on the Vivas you've done, what things you can improve on. And then in the last week, I just went through the flashcards I'd made at the end of my written with all like the important small points, numbers, that kind of thing. It just refreshed those in my head. I thought that was probably the most helpful, just to kind of like, I think by the time I got to the last week, my Viva performance was probably getting worse just because I don't know, I was just getting tired of doing them. And I think I wasn't putting as much thought into my answers during the Viva as I did when I first did it, just because you do one Viva after the next. I think you don't have time to kind of tweak and improve your performance. And so that's what I found, I guess, coming up to the Vivas. And that's what I found helped the last weeks of unwinding a bit. Just going back to revising a few things and chilling out a bit, really. Yeah, just make sure you're on even keel when you come to Viva Day.
Did anyone have a different approach where they needed to be more stressed going into a Viva? And I know that for myself, I lost my mojo not doing a Viva in the last 3 days. And I found that probably hampered my performance on the day because I didn't have, I don't know, there's a routine you get into the Vivas that you just like, oh, yep, I know how to answer these questions. Did anyone feel the opposite way, or did everyone kind of do Nathan's approach?
I found myself feeling pretty similar to Nathan in that I felt like I probably hit my peak Viva performance like a week and a half or 2 weeks before the Viva. I think the Vivas are very much a confidence-based game. You know, there is a certain amount of knowledge, but when you get to the end, you really know all the core stuff. If you've got an invite to the viva and you'll get feedback from the bosses, but I feel like, you know enough stuff, and it's just how you perform. And I guess the big advice I have is, firstly, try to get like core vivas in that week before, and don't let your confidence be knocked by one or two bad vivas, because everyone's going to get a bad viva at some point really close to the exam. Okay. And you just have to realize that that's not the be all and end all, and just don't let yourself spiral with that. If I can add one more thing as well, just between your vivas and your written. So one thing that I would have changed is that in between your written and your vivas, you take a few weeks off, and you should take a few weeks off to unwind. When you get back into it, you first start by looking over all your core topics again. And this is the point at where having a good set of notes is really important. I never really made notes for my written. I made Microsoft Word kind of written SAQs, and then I made Anki flashcards, but I didn't have a bank of notes to go back to. And if I did my time again, I think that would be really, really useful, because you need to look over everything when you start after the written before you start going to the vivas, because there's a lot of content that is just not tested in the SAQs or MCQs commonly that does come up super often in vivas. So having a base, not saying you have to write your own notes, but having a good set of contents to be able to go back and look through, something I would have changed as well. Sorry, I know that's a bit separate to your question, but I wanted to get that out there.
No, that's a very, very good tip. A good set of notes saves you a lot of times, because you need that just as your base, like you pointed out. What about you, San-Rene? What did you do to prepare?
Well, I found that for the vivas, like what you're saying, Elliot, it's such a confidence game. And so that's that thing about self-belief again, which I know they talk about a lot of the differences between male and female trainees and blah, 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 and self-confidence and things like that. But I think that plays a really big factor in this. And I found that I was always like chasing the high of having a good viva and needing that to like carry me through to the next one. And so when I think I did my last viva a week before the actual viva day. And so the time when I was in Melbourne, I got there a bit earlier. And so in those couple of days leading up to it, I was like, I need my high again. Like I need to have a really good viva to like carry me through. But you're in Melbourne, and it's this toss up of like, oh, you don't want to over practice, and I don't want a bad one to end. Otherwise, like my juju will be off. And so then I was like, I need to like keep my high going. So that was probably like the hardest bit I found for me. Like I don't think that I peaked like weeks before, like some bosses who I've spoken to in the past. Like I don't think I over practiced, because I tried to like time my practicing right so that I could peak at the time. But the thing was like the high, like I needed to finish on a strong viva so that I felt good about myself.
Yeah.
Which sounds crazy, but like it's such a mental game.
Yeah.
And it is a performance on the day, so you need to be in the right mindset for it.
Yeah, and that also comes with little things that you don't realize, like dressing in comfortable suit, or clothes, and wearing your lucky socks, and wearing your like tie that makes you feel comfortable and you think you look good in. Because half of it is your first impression to the examiner. And despite everything, some examiners are completely stone faced, you're never going to get through them, but some examiners are really nice and they genuinely seem like they are giving you emotional feedback. So that kind of stuff that you don't really think about, dressing well, making yourself feel comfortable, also goes part with that confidence, because you wanted that to be your only shot, and you don't want to come back from your viva being like, oh God, I wish I'd done that. But in saying that, I think no matter what you do, you'll always do something silly in a viva. I know I did lots of silly things in a viva, but is there anything silly that you regret now, looking back at it, that just happened in the heat of the moment because of anxiety?
Lots of word spaghetti, and just forgetting. Sometimes they're asking you something really, really simple, and you're just so flustered that you can't think. Like they kept asking me an Viva about phenylephrine, like, where does it work? And I was like, oh, vascular smooth muscle. And all they wanted was skeletal muscle. And spent like 45, but like, in the moment, you just sometimes get into like a little bit of a, everything just stops moving in my head sometimes. And then I'm just not going to be able to say anything. So I think if I had my time again, I'd just be like, I don't know, and move on. And that's actually what I ended up doing. And I ended up coming back and saying it later because they were asking me about something else. And they were like, oh, is that what you meant before? And I was like, yes. So I guess the thing to take out of that is that most of the time the Viva examiners, as you said, are really nice. And they'll give you like cues like, I agree with that statement. I also think that's correct. I had a lot of examiners that were saying things like that on the day.
And it's like the sports analogy. Like, good examiner can't really give you confidence, but a bad examiner can definitely take away your confidence. And you just hope you don't get too many of those bad examiners that will take away your confidence. Look, I think that brings us to the end of this kind of podcast, and I want to thank you guys all for being so open and sharing your tips, your valuable resources, your emotional, mental journey to finally get to here. And just congratulate all three of you for succeeding. And now you realize no one cares because you all passed. But it's such a momentous thing. And I just, for anyone that's going through the exam now, I think at the end of the day, this is just a job. It's not bigger than life. So on that note, I just want to say thank you all for sharing your stories. If you have any wise words for anyone, this is your moment.
I have one more thing to say. I know you're trying to finish your podcast. Sorry. Feel free to cut me off. But
I thought I ended that really well.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. I just had one thing that I forgot to say before. It's just that during the whole process, I had a few moments where I just like broke down because I was so scared of failing because there was so much pressure. And I sat down with my wife and she reminded me that just because you fail this exam doesn't mean you're a bad dad. It doesn't mean you're a bad husband, and that, if you don't pass, it's okay. You'll still be a dad. You'll still be a husband. And, life still goes on and you consider it again. It'll suck. It will suck to do it again. But at the end of the day, you still got your family. And, it's, as you said, it's just a job. So, sorry, I know you're trying to finish your podcast, but
I'm really sorry.
I just wanted to put that out there
as well. Is that like your support network is so important during this. Like, you are your own hype man, but you need like other hype people behind you as well. And like they just make this happen. And like, kudos to anybody who is doing this on their own. But I just found that having your hype people behind you just makes you keep going. And like a really small silly thing was that like I had to get my Viva suit sent up from Sydney where we've got a place, and my husband brought it back in like a little suit bag thing, and he had like put a little sticky note on it and it said like, your Viva super suit. And I was like, yeah, that's my Viva super suit. And then the first time when I wore it to one of our SCOO practice nights, I remember Nathan, you were like, you look like a corporate lawyer in that outfit. And I was like, you know what? I can be anything in this outfit because I look shit hot in this outfit. So I was like, I can do this. And so have your hype people and remember to thank them at the end.
I think you guys have summarized and ended my podcast better than I have. And so this is the unofficial relaunch of the podcast not relaunch, the start of our second season of Count to 10. And as Nathan has coined it before we started the podcast, it's my mini pods. We'll be starting in 2 weeks' time. And we're going to cover one topic and one SAQ related to that. And the first topic is going to be comparing and contrasting the cardiac muscle action potential versus the pacemaker action potential. A common SAQ and easy topic to get the ball rolling. So tune in next time to listen. And thanks again, guys, for joining me. And congratulations one last time.
Thanks very much, mate. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.